Bang! The sharp crack of gunfire sliced through the humid air of the Willow Creek shooting range, a gritty patch of land on the edge of town where dust clung to everything and the scent of gunpowder was as familiar as morning coffee. The range was alive with the hum of anticipation. Today was the annual Willow Creek Sharpshooting Championship, a local legend that drew shooters from across the county. Spectators lined the wooden bleachers, their murmurs blending with the clatter of spent casings hitting the ground. All eyes were on the usual suspects, grizzled men in tactical vests, their rifles gleaming, swapping boasts about past victories. But then, a hush fell over one corner of the crowd as Clara Thompson stepped through the gate. Clara, a 42-year-old librarian, looked like she'd wandered into the wrong story. Her wire-rimmed glasses sat slightly askew on her nose. Her faded blue cardigan hung loose over a plain cotton dress, and her sensible loafers crunched awkwardly on the gravel. In her hands, she clutched a worn leather rifle case, its edges frayed from years of quiet storage. The men at the check-in table barely glanced up as she approached, her soft voice nearly lost in the din. "I'd like to register, please," she said, her tone polite but firm. The organizer, a burly man with a clipboard and a smirk, raised an eyebrow. "You sure you're in the right place, ma'am?" he asked, his voice dripping with condescension. The crowd nearby snickered, a few tossing glances her way as if she were a curiosity, not a competitor. "Lane 12, he muttered, waving her off to the farthest edge of the range, where the targets were half obscured by dust and neglect. Clara didn't flinch at the dismissal. She walked to her assigned spot, her steps measured, her grip on the case steady. The whispers followed her like a shadow. "Who's that? What's she doing here? Bet she's never held a gun in her life." A group of younger shooters, their caps turned backward, chuckled as they polished their high-tech rifles, their confidence as loud as their banter. To them, Clara was invisible, a nobody in a world ruled by swagger and skill. The reigning champion, Jake Bullseye Carter, was the star of the show, and no one, not the locals, not the competitors, not even the rangemaster, expected anyone else to steal his spotlight. Jake's name was on everyone's lips, his record-breaking score from last year, a benchmark no one dared dream of touching. But Clara wasn't here for their approval. She wasn't here for fame or trophies or the fleeting thrill of proving them wrong. She was here for a promise, one she'd made years ago under a different sky to a man who'd believed in her when no one else did. Her father, Henry Thompson, a retired Marine with a laugh as warm as summer and hands calloused from years of service, had taught her to shoot when she was just a girl. They'd spent countless afternoons in the fields behind their old farmhouse, the .22 rifle he'd gifted her balanced in her small hands. "It's not about the target, Clara," he'd say, his voice steady as he adjusted her grip. "It's about focus. It's about heart." Those lessons had stayed with her, even after life pulled her away from the range. Through college, a quiet career shelving books, and the slow heartbreak of losing her father to illness 2 years ago. Now, standing in lane 12, Clara felt the weight of that promise. She'd found the rifle case in her attic last month, tucked beside a box of her father's old letters. Inside was a note in his familiar scrawl. "Shoot again, kid, for me." The words had hit her like a wave, stirring memories of sunlit fields and the crack of a well-aimed shot. She hadn't touched a rifle in over a decade, but something in that note had sparked a fire. She'd spent weeks practicing in secret, driving to a secluded range an hour away, relearning the rhythm of her father's lessons. Each shot had felt like a conversation with him, a way to keep him close. As she set the case on the rickety table, in lane 12, the crowd's murmurs faded into the background. She opened it slowly, revealing the .22 rifle, its walnut stock polished to a soft sheen, the barrel still gleaming despite its age. Etched into the wood were her initials, CT carved. When she was 10, a gift from her father on her birthday. The sight of it steadied her racing heart. She could feel the eyes of the other shooters, their smirks and sidelong glances, but they didn't matter. Not now. She wasn't shooting for them. She was shooting for the man who'd taught her to aim true, not just at targets, but at life. Hart adjusted her glasses, her fingers brushing the cool metal of the rifle. The rangemaster's voice crackled over the speaker, calling the first round. Jake Carter was up first, and the crowd roared as he stepped to his lane, all swagger and certainty. Clara ignored the noise, her world narrowing to the feel of the rifle, the weight of her promise, and the target 50 yards away. She loaded a single round, her movement slow and deliberate, like a ritual. The snickers from the crowd didn't reach her. The doubts didn't touch her. She raised the rifle, her shoulders squared, her breath steady. This was her moment, not not to prove herself to the world, but to honor the one person who'd always seen her strength. The Willow Creek shooting range was Jake Carter's kingdom, and he wore his crown with unshakable confidence. At 32, Jake was a local legend, his chiseled jaw and mirrored sunglasses as much a part of his persona as the custom-built rifle slung over his shoulder. The crowd adored him, their cheers erupting with every shot he fired during warm-ups. Crack! Another bullseye! Crack! Another perfect hit! "That's my boy!" shouted his friend Tommy, a stocky man in a camo cap tossing back an energy drink. Jake grinned, soaking in the applause like it was oxygen. His record from last year, 498 out of 500 points, was the gold standard, a score whispered about with reverence. To the spectators packing the bleachers, the competition was a formality, a stage for Jake to cement his legacy. "Ain't nobody touching bullseye," Tommy boasted, elbowing another buddy. The group laughed, their voices carrying over the clatter of spent casings. Jake's presence dominated the range. He moved with a swagger, his tactical vest bristling with gear, his rifle a sleek masterpiece of engineering that cost more than most people's rent. Between shots, he bantered with his crew, swapping stories of past victories. "Remember that tournament in Carson?" he said, leaning against a barrier. "Wind was howling, and I still dropped every shot dead center." His friends roared, slapping his back. To them, Jake was untouchable, a force of nature who'd turned shooting into an art form. The other competitors, a mix of seasoned locals and out-of-towners, respected him, even feared him. They knew the leaderboard was his domain, and they were fighting for second place. Across the range, in the forgotten corner of lane 12, Clara Thompson was a ghost. The other shooters barely registered her presence, their focus locked on Jake or their own preparations. Her faded cardigan and sensible loafers stood out against the sea of tactical gear, marking her as an outsider. A wiry shooter with a goatee, wiping down his scope nearby, glanced her way and snorted, "Hey, Grandma, you sure you can lift that thing?" he called, his voice cutting through the noise. Laughter rippled through the nearby lanes, sharp and mocking. Another competitor, a burly man with a beard, chimed in, "Bet she's here to knit a target instead." The crowd chuckled, their attention briefly flickering to Clara before dismissing her as a curiosity, not a threat. Clara didn't react. Her face remained calm, her hands steady as she opened her father's leather case. The rifle inside gleamed softly, its walnut stock polished by years of care, her initials, CT, etched into the wood from when she was 10. The sight of it grounded her, a tether to memories of sunlit fields and her father's patient voice. She could feel the weight of the crowd's doubt, their assumption that she was out of her depth, but it didn't shake her. She wasn't here to compete with Jake's ego or the range's bravado. She was here for something deeper, something they couldn't understand. As Jake fired another warm-up round, the Rangemaster's voice crackled over the speaker, outlining the rules. 5 shots per round, 10 rounds total. Highest score takes the title. The crowd buzzed, phones already out to record Jake's inevitable triumph. He adjusted his sunglasses, flashing a grin at a group of fans who waved homemade signs reading "Bullseye Rules." His confidence was infectious, and the atmosphere crackled with it. Even the Rangemaster, a grizzled veteran named Earl, seemed to favor him, his announcements lingering on Jake's name with a hint of pride. To everyone, the story was written. Jake would win, the crowd would cheer, and Willow Creek would have another year of bragging rights. Clara, meanwhile, worked quietly in her lane. She checked the rifle's sights, her fingers moving with a precision that went unnoticed. The snickers continued. A few shooters mimicked her slow movements, exaggerating them for laughs, but she shut them out. Her mind was elsewhere, back in the fields with her father, Henry, his Marine cap tilted back as he coached her. "Breathe, Clara. Let the world fall away." Those lessons had been about more than shooting. They'd been about resilience, about finding strength in the face of doubt. Henry had believed in her even when she was a skinny kid who could barely hold the rifle steady. Now, years later, that belief was her armor. The contrast between Jake and Clara couldn't have been starker. He was the sun, drawing every eye. She was the shadow, overlooked and underestimated. Jake's world was one of trophies and applause, built on years of dominating ranges like this one. Clara's world was quieter, rooted in a promise made to a man who taught her to aim not just at targets, but at her own fears. As Jake fired another perfect shot, the crowd's roar drowned out the soft click of Clara loading her first round. She adjusted her glasses, her breath steadying, her focus narrowing to the target 50 yards away. The range was Jake's stage, but Lane 12 was her sanctuary. The Willow Creek shooting range hummed with the rhythm of the competition. The rangemaster's voice crackled over the ancient speaker system, calling out lanes and scores with a gravelly monotony. Shooters stepped up, fired their rounds, and stepped back, the crowd's cheers rising and falling like waves. Jake Carter's name dominated the leaderboard, his scores flashing in bold numbers that seemed to mock the other competitors. Each of his shots was a masterclass. Crack! The bullet slicing through the center of the target, the crowd erupting in predictable applause. "That's how you do it," Jake shouted, pumping his fist, his mirrored sunglasses catching the sun. Spectators held up phones, capturing every moment for social media, already captioning their videos with "Bullseye does it again." The air was thick with the scent of gunpowder and the weight of Jake's inevitable victory. Then came Clara's turn. The rangemaster's voice, flat and disinterested, cut through the noise. "Lane 12, you're up." A few heads turned, more out of curiosity than expectation. Most of the crowd didn't even bother to look, their eyes glued to Jake or their own conversations. A group of younger shooters nearby snickered, one whispering, "This ought to be good." Another, the wiry guy with the goatee who'd mocked her earlier, leaned over to his friend and muttered, "Bet she misses the target entirely." The laughter that followed was sharp, but Clara didn't flinch. She stood in lane 12, the dust swirling around her loafers, her faded cardigan out of place among the tactical vests and camo hats. The target, 50 yards away, was a speck in the haze, its black bullseye barely visible through the afternoon glare. Clara raised her father's .22 rifle, her movement slow and deliberate, like a musician preparing for a performance. She adjusted her glasses, her fingers brushing the etched initials on the stock, CT, carved when she was 10, a gift from her father on a birthday long past. The crowd's noise faded into a distant hum as she settled into her stance, her shoulders squared. Her breath steady. She could almost hear her father's voice, warm and steady. "Breathe, Clara. Let the world fall away." She exhaled, her finger resting lightly on the trigger, and squeezed. Crack! The sound was sharp but unremarkable in the rhythm of the range. A few spectators glanced over, expecting nothing. The rangemaster, Earl, leaned into his spotting scope, his bushy eyebrows knitting together as he checked the target. He blinked, then checked again, his weathered face tightening with disbelief. "Bullseye!" he called, his voice cracking with surprise. A murmur rippled through the crowd, heads turning toward lane 12. "What? Who's that?" The goatee guy snorted, crossing his arms. "Fluke," he muttered, loud enough for his buddies to nod in agreement. Clara didn't hear them. She reloaded, her hands moving with the same quiet precision, each motion a memory of her father's lessons in the fields behind their old farmhouse. She could see him now, his marine cap tilted back, his calloused hands guiding hers. "It's not about the target, Clara. It's about focus. It's about heart." She raised the rifle again, her eyes locking onto the distant bullseye. Crack! Another shot, another perfect hit. Earl's voice rang out again, louder this time. "Bullseye!" The murmurs grew into a low buzz, like a hive stirring. Spectators craned their necks, phones now pointing toward Clara's lane. Jake, leaning against a barrier with his arms crossed, glanced over, his smirk faltering for the first time. Clara fired 3 more times, each shot a mirror of the last. Crack! 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 Each one landing dead center. By her 5th shot, the scoreboard flashed an impossible truth. Clara Thompson, the librarian in lane 12, was tied with Jake Carter. The crowd's laughter had vanished, replaced by a stunned silence broken only by scattered gasps. Earl, scratching his head, double-checked. The scope again, muttering to himself, "Well, I'll be damned." The goatee guy's jaw dropped, his buddies exchanging wide-eyed looks. "No way." One whispered, "She's gotta be cheating or something." But the target told no lies. 5 perfect holes clustered in the bullseye, as precise as if they'd been drawn with a pen. Jake pushed off the barrier, his sunglasses hiding the flicker of unease in his eyes. He tilted his head toward Clara's lane, sizing her up for the first time. The crowd's attention split, torn between their golden boy and this unassuming woman who'd just rewritten the script. A few spectators started clapping, hesitant at first, then louder, as if waking up to the possibility of an upset. Clara lowered her rifle, her face unreadable, her glasses catching a glint of sunlight. She didn't acknowledge the crowd or the whispers. She didn't need to. She'd come to keep a promise, and with every shot, she was doing just that. The Willow Creek shooting range had never seen a moment like this. The scoreboard, glowing under the harsh afternoon sun, told an impossible story. Clara Thompson, the unassuming librarian in lane 12, was tied with Jake Bullseye Carter, the reigning champion whose name was synonymous with victory. The crowd, once a sea of cheers for Jake, now buzzed with a restless energy, their phones raised to capture what felt like the edge of history. The range master, Earl, his weathered face creased with disbelief, announced a sudden death tiebreaker to decide the champion. 5 shots, 1 round, closest to the center wins, he barked over the speaker, his voice carrying a rare note of excitement. The air crackled with anticipation, the scent of gunpowder mingling with the tension that hung over the range like a storm cloud. Jake stepped up first, his swagger intact, but his movements tighter, more deliberate. The crowd's roar was deafening as he raised his custom rifle, its sleek barrel glinting like a predator's teeth. He adjusted his sunglasses, flashing a grin that was equal parts confidence and bravado. "Let's end this," he called out, his voice cutting through the noise. The spectators erupted, chanting "Bullseye, bullseye," as if their cheers could will him to victory. Jake's first shot rang out, crack, and the Rangemaster's scope confirmed it. A perfect bullseye. The crowd screamed, waving homemade signs. 4 more shots followed, each one a masterclass in precision, each one landing dead center. After his 5th shot, Jake lowered his rifle, turning to the crowd with a triumphant fist pump. "Beat that, librarian!" he shouted, his taunt aimed at Clara, who stood quietly in her lane. His buddies roared with laughter, Tommy yelling, "Game over, folks!" The scoreboard flashed Jake's score, a flawless 50 points, a performance that seemed unbeatable. But the crowd's cheers faltered as eyes turned to lane 12. Clara stood alone, her faded cardigan a stark contrast to the tactical gear around her. The snickers from earlier had faded, replaced by a curious hush. Spectators who'd dismissed her now leaned forward, their phones trained on her every move. The goatee guy who'd mocked her as grandma stood with his arms crossed, his smirk replaced by a furrowed brow. Clara adjusted her glasses, her face calm but her eyes sharp with focus. She opened her father's leather case one last time, running her fingers over the etched initials, CT, on the .22's stock. The rifle felt like an extension of her, a bridge to the fields where her father had taught her to shoot, his voice echoing in her mind. "It's about heart, Clara. Let the world fall away." She stepped to the firing line, her loafers kicking up small clouds of dust. The Rangemaster's voice crackled. "Lane 12, you're up." Clara raised the rifle, her form as steady as a statue, her breathing slow and measured. The crowd held its breath, the silence so thick it seemed to press against the air. Crack! Her first shot pierced the quiet, and Earl's voice rang out. "Bullseye!" A murmur rippled through the crowd, phone zooming in on the target. Clara reloaded, her hands moving with the precision of a clockmaker. Crack! Bullseye! Earl called again, his tone rising with disbelief. The murmurs grew louder, a few spectators clapping hesitantly. Jake shifted in his lane, his sunglasses hiding the flicker of unease in his eyes. Clara's 3rd shot, crack! Landed perfectly, then her 4th. The crowd was no longer silent. Gasps and whispers filled the air, a growing wave of awe. "Who is she?" someone muttered. "No way she keeps this up," said another, but their voices lacked conviction. Clara's focus was unbreakable. Her world narrowed to the target 50 yards away. She could feel her father's presence, his lessons anchoring her. Crack! Her 5th shot was different. So precise it clipped the absolute center of the bullseye. A feat so rare it sent Earl scrambling to his scope. He checked once, twice, then turned to the crowd, his voice booming. "Bullseye! Perfect center!" The range erupted, cheers and gasps drowning out the lingering doubts. The scoreboard flashed. Clara Thompson, 50 points, plus a fractional edge over Jake's record. Her final shot measured as a hair closer to the target's heart. The crowd went wild, a mix of disbelief and exhilaration. Spectators surged forward, phones capturing Clara's calm figure against the chaos. Jake stood frozen, his rifle lowered, his jaw tight. The goatee guy's arms dropped, his buddies staring open-mouthed. "Clara Thompson, new Willow Creek champion," Earl shouted, his voice cracking with excitement. Clara lowered her rifle, a quiet smile breaking through her composed expression. She didn't bask in the applause or acknowledge Jake's stunned silence. She'd done what she came to do, not to outshine a champion, but to honor a promise. The Willow Creek shooting range was a storm of noise and motion as Clara Thompson's victory sank in. The crowd, once a wall of skepticism, now surged forward, their cheers a tidal wave of awe and disbelief. Spectators shouted her name, their phone still recording, capturing the moment when the unassuming librarian in the faded cardigan rewrote the range's history. The scoreboard glowed with her name above Jake's, the fractional difference in her final shot a hair's breadth closer to the target's heart, etched into Willow Creek legend. Clara stood in lane 12, her father's .22 rifle lowered, her face calm but her eyes bright with a quiet triumph. She didn't bask in the applause or meet the crowd's gazes. Instead, she turned away, slipping through the chaos toward a quiet corner of the range where the dust settled and the world felt still. In her hands, she clutched the worn leather case, its surface soft from years of her father's touch. She set it on a weathered bench, her fingers trembling slightly as she opened it one last time. Tucked inside beneath the rifle was a faded photograph she'd carried all day. It showed her father, Henry Thompson, in his Marine uniform, his smile warm under the brim of his cap. Beside him stood a 10-year-old Clara, her pigtails messy, her small hands gripping the same .22 rifle now resting in the case. The photo was creased from years of handling, its edges soft like the memories it held. Clara traced her father's face with her thumb, her voice a whisper lost in the crowd's roar. "I did it, Dad." The promise had been made 2 years ago. In the quiet of a hospital room where Henry's strength was fading, he'd held her hand, his voice weak but steady, and asked her to shoot again, not for medals, but to remember who she was. "You're stronger than you know, kid," he'd said, his eyes bright despite the pain. Clara had found his rifle case in the attic a month ago, along with a note in his scrawl. "Shoot again, kid, for me." That note had brought her here, to a range where she was a stranger, to face a crowd that saw her as nothing. Every shot she'd fired today was a conversation with him, a way to keep his lessons alive. Focus, grit, and never letting others define your worth. As the crowd's cheers faded into the background, Clara's moment of solitude was interrupted. Jake Carter approached, his mirrored sunglasses pushed up onto his head, revealing eyes that held a mix of grudging respect and curiosity. The swagger was still there, but it was tempered, his shoulders less rigid, his voice softer. "Where'd you learn to shoot like that?" he asked, his tone devoid of the taunt he'd thrown earlier. Clara glanced at the photo, then at him. "From someone who believed in me," she said simply, her words carrying the weight of a lifetime. Jake nodded, a faint smile breaking through. "Your old man, huh? He must have been one hell of a teacher." Clara's smile was small but genuine. "He was." The Rangemaster, Earl, pushed through the crowd, holding a small plaque engraved with Willow Creek Champion. He handed it to Clara, his weathered face cracking into a grin. "Didn't see that coming, ma'am," he said, shaking his head. "You're something else." Clara accepted the plaque with a quiet "thank you," her fingers brushing the cool metal. The crowd pressed closer, some offering congratulations, others asking for photos, their skepticism replaced by admiration. A young girl, no older than Clara had been in the photo, tugged at her mother's sleeve and pointed. "Mom, she's awesome." Clara caught the girl's eye and smiled, a flicker of her younger self reflected in the child's awe. By nightfall, videos of Clara's victory were flooding YouTube and social media, racking up millions of views. Comments poured in, "Never. Judge a book by its cover. Clara's my hero. This is why you don't underestimate anyone." The story spread like wildfire, shared by people inspired by her quiet strength and the way she'd turned doubt into triumph. News outlets picked it up, headlines calling her the librarian sharpshooter and the underdog who broke records. But Clara didn't chase the fame. She returned to her small library in town where the hum of fluorescent lights and the scent of old books welcomed her back. On her desk, beside a stack of overdue notices, she placed the plaque from the range. It wasn't the trophy that mattered. It was the photo she propped next to it, her father's smile a reminder of why she'd stepped into lane 12. Every day, as she shelved books or helped a patron, she'd glance at that photo, her heart steady, with the knowledge that she'd kept her promise. The world might see her as a viral sensation, but to Clara, she was still Henry's daughter, carrying his lessons in every step. The quietest people she'd learned often carry the loudest stories, and hers was one the world would never forget.